Too many alerts and not enough action? It's time to get SaltStack. SaltStack is an intelligent IT automation platform that detects security issues in critical business systems and then actually fixes them. With SaltStack, security and IT teams work together to define custom security policies with certified checks for CIS, DISA-STIGs, and more. You can scan systems for millions of compliance checks in minutes. Remediate compliance and vulnerability issues with powerful automation, all in a single platform. Visit securityweekly.com/SaltStack to learn more. SysDig is the first cloud-native visibility and security platform that eliminates the need for standalone tools like container security and monitoring. Using SysDig's unique data approach, enterprises can solve a variety of visibility and security issues at massive enterprise scale for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. SysDig will enable your organization to scan and block vulnerable images and enforce best practices pre-production, block threats, enforce compliance, and monitor application performance, proactively alert on incidents, reduce MTTR with forensics, and capture detailed audit records, all from a single unified platform. Accelerate your transition to containers and then have confidence in your ongoing operations using SysDig. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/SysDig.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman. Security Weekly will be at Hacker Halted in Atlanta, Georgia this October 10th through 11th. EC Council is offering our listeners a $100 discount to attend the two-day conference. Use discount code HH19SW when you register or go to securityweekly.com/hackerhalted and register there. Make sure you check out the keynote, Paul Asadorian, and Mr. Jeff Mann's talk as well. So, Matt, we were just talking about some of the dearth of product news coming out of Black Hat, but I think there actually has been quite a bit of cybersecurity news in the last couple weeks anyway. So both from Black Hat and outside of Black Hat. Probably one of the more interesting ones or notable ones is the breach reported by Capital One. And this was pretty interesting because, from what I understand, it sounds like it was a cascade of configuration problems that caused this. So essentially, a commercial web app firewall was misconfigured. Attacker was able to grab the credentials, the IAM credentials used by that WAF, and then pivoted from there to access S3 buckets. So kind of simple, kind of straightforward, but pretty impactful. And kind of if anything, sort of a story that we've heard before.
Yeah, and the reason I pulled this article in is because they're scratching the surface. The article is labeled "The Problem with Web App Security," and they talk about the WAF. Well, there's your problem right there in itself. Application security is way more than the WAF, right? And the best line in this article is 99 problems and WAFs are just one. But then the article spends all this time on the web app firewall. So you and I have a little history with this, Mike, right? In that WAFs are only one part of this, and this sits on the perimeter. And this is why I'm not a big firewall fan in general, because a firewall can't see a lot of stuff. And what it can see, sometimes it can and can't block because nobody's going to stop a transaction and bring down the business, right? The root of a lot of these issues is configuration. And here we are talking about the web app firewall when really what's going on is we're not validating the configuration of our infrastructure and all these different services that we're using. Paul and I have been talking about this for the past couple months when we did a webcast with SaltStack and a couple others, because we're seeing this trend of nobody's looking at the darn configurations. We're so worried about doing static code analysis and doing dynamic testing in the WAF and the RAS that we're not looking at the basic configuration going, oh, why do we have it configured that way? It's misconfigured. And one of my interviews at Black Hat, we kind of dug into this a little bit. My thesis is configuration isn't sexy. It's way more fun to look for vulnerabilities or to look for bugs or to look for the latest exploit than it is to do some basic hygiene of just verifying that your configurations are configured correctly. And here we are with another configuration breach.
Absolutely. I think there's also a bit of an aspect now. This isn't necessarily as specifically what happened with Capital One. I think I know Capital One has actually made they're one of the banks that actually made a big deal about really pushing into the cloud. So it's not like they are without domain knowledge in the area or expertise in the area. So it's also the idea, an example of it can happen to the best of the blue teams out there. But there's also the idea of speaking about WAFs more in general. It's just relying on them or diving into them is a little bit of that idea that we're just going to lift and shift into the cloud rather than adopting like a cloud native approach to your application security. Meaning, cloud native approach is more of how much can we restrict what access these applications have. And basically what I'm also describing, how much can we go through and minimize the privileges needed for these configurations or for these accounts that these different services need and what they need access to. And you're totally right that it's not the cool stuff to do. It's also complex. And small mistakes can have really big impacts. So for example, if it's true that, for example, the WAF credentials had read access to S3 buckets, why is that? Your WAF isn't inspecting them. Your WAF is ostensibly just inspecting inbound traffic. Maybe it's looking at a little bit of outbound traffic, but WAFs kind of don't really do that either well or to any highly scalable degree that I've come across. So it's also one of those things that if DevOps teams or if people are being driven to say, oh, look, we have the cloud, we can deploy fast, we can do things fast. But if one of the ways to continue to move fast is just to go with, this open configuration or this high, large privilege grant is the easiest way to go forward, then that's actually a bit of an anti-pattern to get in front of, or that's the wrong behavior we want to be driving.
Yeah, and 2 points on this one. Number one is I think we've got to get ahead of the deployment of the infrastructure and really understand the interdependencies of all these different services that are up there. And this is not an easy challenge, by the way, but visibility into how that infrastructure is being configured has to be one of the things we have to focus on. Because if we would have caught that early on, we would have said, well, wait a minute. Why does the WAF need read access to the S3 buckets that potentially could leak data? That makes no sense, right? But because of the complexity in a cloud native environment, which Capital One is a real big adopter of cloud native, it's hard to get that visibility. It's hard to see that. That's the first piece. And your lift and shift example, and we are still seeing a lot of lift and shift. And so even in that environment, though, there are configurations that have to be done well in your AWS accounts for your EC2 instances and some of the other tools that you're using, even in a lift and shift. So this doesn't go away whether you're just doing basic lift and shift or you're doing full cloud native re-architecture. You still have to do the basic configuration validations, and we're just forgetting about them. And look, we didn't do a good job of this when we were on-prem either, so it doesn't surprise me that we're not doing a good job in the cloud.
Right. And it's the one thing that does surprise me, or I guess that makes me a little bit sadder about the situation, is that the cloud should at least give us better visibility, because there's a lot of the cloud services have some great granularity. But with that becomes a lot of confusion about what exactly privileges do we need? How do we get down to the absolute, basically what is it, 30-year, 40-year-old aphorism to say, least privilege access.
Yeah.
But being able to enforce that becomes a lot more complex.
Yeah, and across all these interdependencies, that's the other issue. There's so many interdependencies in the cloud, and that where you think you may be doing least privilege in one place might actually not be least privilege in another place, and it's understanding that I think is still pretty difficult. And the other thing is everybody's doing this after the fact. So we're waiting until the infrastructure is spun up to do these checks. And we all know that within 15 seconds of that environment being spun up, China's starting to port scan the thing, right? So I think that's a little late. I'd like to see it earlier in the process so that we could say, wait a minute, we sure we wanted to configure the environment that way when we spin it up? Maybe we want to check there. So that's where I see some really interesting opportunity for the future.
Yeah, and I think we also have some opportunities for the cloud providers to help with this. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was Microsoft Azure. Their security, part of their security center would basically say, hey, check out this account has this role, but it hasn't actually touched any asset that has required this role in X amount of time. Maybe it's time to get rid of it. And I think that idea of just start to kind of decay what a role can do over time if they're not using it is kind of smart. So it's just that, sure, maybe we made this configuration, but it was misconfigured with too much, and the service actually can see what's going on, and it can report and say, hey, it's crickets over here. Why don't we just turn this off for now?
Yeah, one of the interviews I forgot to mention on the last segment is just-in-time access and the ability to provide just-in-time access on a limited time scale so that you don't have those credentials sitting around. It's providing least access with a time bound behind it so that although you're giving them access for this amount of time with these privileges, it's going to expire, so these accounts aren't going to hang around. And I thought that was really interesting, kind of to that Microsoft of, hey, identify it. They're actually saying, no, that's the way you're going to get access in this environment. It's going to be limited, and it's going to be time-based.
So there's also kind of going to take a chance for a segue here and go from the idea of how we're approaching, cloud native and those designs around configurations and identity management. Let's go to the other end of that spectrum to the browser and how it is interacting with websites. So Chrome recently announced that they're going to remove that, basically how the nav bar turns green for EV certs, extended validation certs. Essentially, they're saying, we thought this was a good idea to give users a way to understand when they're interacting with a website that actually says that the certificate belongs to this website, rather than it's just they click here and pass through. But the idea of the EV cert kind of never took on, and the idea of signal as a signal to users it just never picked up, because users were like, oh, something's green, I'll just continue on, or, oh, I didn't even notice that part of the nav bar turned green when this weird esoteric aspect of a certificate was confirmed with extended validation, which, for my cynical friends out there, just means that the certificate authorities basically charge more money for a particular type of cert.
So I was a little confused by this one, because to me, green means good.
Yep.
And I do notice it. Now, maybe the basic user doesn't, but why go backwards? To me, this is going backwards to a point where what used to be something we could visualize, they're just taking it away. I didn't understand this one at all.
So I like this approach in the sense of there's, especially on mobile devices, there's a very little screen real estate to be able to show this. Now, I will admit, I do always notice the green, but by the same token, let's take a step back and think, what are we trying to defend against, or what's our threat model that we're trying to address here? And it's the idea that it's phishing, and we have to train users to recognize that, yeah, this is the securityweekly.com website versus this is the Security Weekly with a little 1 instead of an L site that's trying to phish us. What if we started pushing people to have stronger two-factor authentication? Or what if we even went to WebAuthn and we took the attestation of the domain names out of the users basically understanding and trying to decipher what that URL looks like, and put it into the browser itself and say, here are the credentials for this domain and here's the identity tied to it. Hey, other domain, who are you? I'm only allowed to talk to these domains. So I think I get what you're saying there, but I don't think we're actually losing anything by this. And I think we have actually better ways to address the ideas of phishing, rather than just trying to keep pushing the burden onto users to say, yeah, green means go. But what if their certificate is actually signed and it's a totally legit certificate? It turns green, but it doesn't actually say Capital One. Maybe it says the name of the Capital One, like a holding company behind it, something like that, or a bank. So there are also these other edge cases where it can be kind of confusing for users too, even when they're trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. Excuse me. That kind of leads into this HTTP desync attacks, because this was the other one that was interesting, right? As we think about the web communication, part of it's the browser, part of it's the transport layer, right? And so here is the request smuggling reborn discussion around HTTP. So my question to you, because you know this way better than I do, is if we're using HTTPS, is this still possible? Or is this only because it's HTTP and not S?
So that is a great question, and it's one of those things that the request smuggling was, I think it was in 2004 when it first came up. It was really cool, really interesting, and then kind of disappeared for about a decade until good old James Kettle, Portswigger, brought it back. So to your question, this is actually at the HTTP layer, so it's independent of the S. So it doesn't matter that it's going over TLS or not. It's basically taking advantage of the fact that HTTP communication are blobs of text, and these blobs have a preamble of headers, which most people always looked at the verb, get, post, the host header. But there's two important headers that is taken advantage of here, the content length and the transfer encoding. And what this basically means is that typically you'll have a single post request as part of an HTTP request. But and it simply says, here's a post request. I have 51 characters in here because in the body of it is going to be the username and the password and the identity. But it is possible to actually have a whole bunch of other text after those 51 characters. And what that means is that you have a post request, the body of the request that belongs to that post, that original single request. But then the server says, oh, look, there's some additional text here. And this additional text just so happens to be another GET request. And it has its verb, it has a host header, it has all these other things that make it look absolutely like another request. So now I'm going to parse the first one, process it, and now it's time to parse the second one. And this is where that smuggling comes in. That's really cool and taking advantage of HTTP or taking advantage of trust. And this actually goes back to what you were mentioning about earlier in the first segment about what would a zero trust model look like for applications. And because right now, what this desync or this request smuggling attack is doing is basically saying there is too much trust between a front end and a back end web server, because the back end web server, the front end web server has parsed multiple requests. The second request, however, part of this capsulation was created by the attacker, but it just forwards it to the back end server. Back end server says, cool, I was just expecting some information from you, front end server. I'm just going to do whatever this request tells me to do. And it goes from there. So hopefully that helps clarify it, because it's a really well-written paper, but it's definitely out of the ordinary for the typical types of attacks we see at the web layer.
Yeah, and that's why I was trying to understand was this still a vulnerability in if you're using SSL or TLS encryption, and it is, because it's an underlying HTTP protocol issue. So that means we need a new revision of HTTP to potentially prevent this?
Well, the good news is, Matt, glad you mentioned that. We actually do. So HTTP 2 also introduces essentially multiplexing, because basically currently web browsers can do, I think, maybe 6 or so connections to a single origin, and they're trying to basically load a web page as fast as possible. But they're doing it in non-efficient ways just due to the ancient architecture of the HTTP protocol. What HTTP 2 did is say, we're going to interleave a whole bunch of different requests, and we're also going to do over TLS by default, ideally. And we're going to basically make these a lot more performant. We're going to give you a little bit of data frames to be able to say, do you have any data to send yet? Cool. Go send some data to this channel. Basically, here is the channel that's uploading or accessing all the images, or here's the channel that's giving your Twitter stream on the side of your web page, things like that. And if you were using an HTTP 2 endpoints for this, you would have actually been protected from this type of attack. So that's a good thing. So for many reasons, both for performance as well as from this particular security problem, start updating to HTTP 2.0. It's a good thing.
So are we
Also,
seeing
go
just
ahead.
seeing a slow rate of adoption of HTTP 2.0? I'm just curious why we're not there already. If we know there's improvements both from a performance and a security perspective, why are we still using 1.1? Why aren't we just using 2.0 as a default?
Yeah, so it's also honestly I think it's just large organizations are slow to move. It's an inertia problem. So there's the same argument can be made for TLS 1.3, which has the handshake there is much better. So again, you have much more performant initiating connections with TLS 1.3, as well as it's just a lot harder to misconfigure it. There's our bingo word for the day, or do things wrong with TLS 1.3. But unless you're dropping like something like a Cloudflare or some service provider that can do that endpoint termination for you, it's just been slower for the server side to push that out there because all the browsers, all the mobile devices, all the operating systems support it. So this isn't a case where they're waiting for the client population to get up to speed. It's really we need the service and server endpoints to get out there.
Yeah.
And I will note too that this is not just this desync attack is not just a theoretical attack. If you go out back through go to the show notes, and Portswigger wrote a blog post and some examples of how he went through Trello and PayPal, as well as a couple other services. And if you go and look at the bounty programs for those, you can see that James has been poking around these sites since at least January of this year, finding these vulnerabilities. And from what I would guess, from looking at HackerOne and BugCrowd reports, making around 10 or 20K off of these types of findings. So that's pretty good research and well-rewarded research in this case, I think.
Yeah.
And that's also, I think, another segue to pull us into some announcements that Apple, Microsoft, and Google were making around their bug bounty program. So there's a lot of money to be made here. Apple has started up to $1 million. Azure has also talked about bumping it to $300,000 for their top end types of reports. And Google has also I think topping out for 1 million for nominated for a best bug of the year type of approach. So just the money right there is pretty awesome. And I want to get your comments on that before we get into some other aspects, some other more technical, interesting things they were announcing about their bounty programs.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a continual increase in the bug bounty programs. Apple, Microsoft, and Google making big announcements this week to increase payouts. Look, this is why we're finding more vulnerabilities, right? These bug bounty programs are actually helping us find these bugs, right? To your point earlier, we see this increase in vulnerabilities. Are those vulnerabilities part of what I have in my environment? Not. And then the whole prioritization is a whole different piece. But these bug bounty programs are definitely identifying the bugs and the vulnerabilities that are out there. And look, some of these big vendors they want to secure their code better, and so they're going to pay more and more money to do it. I think Apple added some stuff that wasn't covered before with iCloud and a couple of the Watch and some other services that may not have been covered before under their bug bounty programs. But yeah, you're seeing the dollars here, which is interesting.
And the dollar is absolutely interesting. And the other aspect I think stands out even more to me is they're actually also really embracing the community and enabling those good faith researchers to have better tooling. So Apple actually announced that they will have essentially like I can't remember what it was called now, lost my notes, like a device program where they will say here to certain researchers, here is your security research device. So it's basically an iPhone that has better debugging features available on it. So you can have root, you can have your SSH, you can have better debugging. So here, go forth and actually find some vulnerabilities and they're basically saying, we're going to work with you researchers and make it easier for your tooling and for analysis to actually execute and for you to look, rather than make it harder for you to actually get into and break apart sort of a tamper-resistant type of operating system. Now, it's still important to have all of those countermeasures in place. But what they're saying is they're acknowledging that the community is finding good bugs, that they'll pay for good bugs. And for researchers who are demonstrating that they have these types of skills, they'll actually make it easier for them to say, rather than get over the, you must be this tall to ride, we're just going to say, here's the device, go forth and conquer. Let's see what you can find.
And the vendors aren't alone, by the way, because right across from our booth at DEF CON was the Chinese team. They've got bug bounty programs too. So everybody's going to pay for bugs. The Chinese just might use them for a different cause. But I mean, I think there were 2 booths at DEF CON for the Chinese on bug bounty programs, and one was right across from us in the vendor area on Friday and Saturday.
Yeah, I think that's one of the other things is that just going from, because I think it was Apple, it went from 500K to 1 million. So just that alone is also a great way to, disrupt. Sorry, I feel dirty for using that word inside San Francisco, but they're disrupting potentially the vulnerability market space. Because now, if your trade-off for selling a vulnerability used to be $1 million to a third-party market, there's companies in several different countries, France, Israel, Italy for a while, but I think that group has moved, and of course China. But now, if you can go to the vendor for that amount of money, possibly just go to the vendor. So it's also possibly a good market pressure on the third-party payments for vulnerabilities. But an additional thing too is talking about the vendors participating, so providing devices, but also Azure was also setting up a security lab that says, hey, here is a dedicated space to go beat up. And so please beat this up. But you can guess too, of course, they're going to have monitoring. So they can also, it's a great way for them to improve their ML, their logging, their analysis of what goes on against their devices or their cloud instances. But it's also just a great way to say, rather than violating our terms and conditions for our where our customers actually sit, here's an area to go beat it up, and let us know what you found. And that's just another way to make it easier for researchers to come to the vendors themselves rather than to sell it on the aftermarket.
Yeah, and that's interesting because Microsoft will learn a lot through that process and hopefully come up with better secure baselines to protect against those in the future. So that's actually really smart for Microsoft to do it that way. Give them an environment, learn in your environment, and then hopefully put better protections in place for the rest of your customer base.
Yep, absolutely. And hopefully that will mean here are the actual secure baselines that become better baselines that actually we can legitimately call secure, rather than here is the baseline that nobody changes from the defaults, that gets popped all the time or has too much privilege, too much data, chance for data exfiltration, data leakage, etc. So I guess I wanted to also wrap up on one final food for thought. And I think this ties into what we've been discussing even in the last segment. There's this article about the culture-driven approach to DevOps transformation. And really this is, I guess I'll honestly say, it's a bit more of the same in the sense that it's the people that are your DevOps or DevSecOps team. And it's the people that are where the culture emerges from and where the culture makes a difference. And one of the hot points here was communication. I think that's a natural aspect. But also the other point I wanted to highlight is measure what matters. And what I wanted to really emphasize there is once you have a metric, that metric is going to drive behavior, because people will realize, this is either what I'm being promoted against, this is what my bonuses are based on, this is what this is how our application is being evaluated against, whether it's succeeding or failing. Is it being developed? Is that metric just around time to market, or is it around quality, or even around security? But a bad metric can also drive adverse behaviors or undesirable behaviors. So that's one of the things that stood out to me is, yes, that's measure what matters, but what you measure also conveys what you think matters, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's the communication part, I think, is the biggest one right now. Especially between the development and the DevOps teams and security, that communication has to continue to happen. We've got to come up with better metrics. We covered a few weeks back some of the interesting metrics. I mean, it was a long article of things, and I think organizations have to figure out what are the most important things they want to measure to reinforce the behavior internally, and also integrate security and development together. Those will be challenges over the next few years because, look, we haven't solved this well in our normal security programs, let alone this whole new DevSecOps area either.
Yeah. And the article also links to basically a survey that was sponsored by Google Cloud or created by Google Cloud. And in it, it was highlighting two things that stood out to me. One was that the leaders in basically those who at least self-attest that they're doing DevOps really well, they say they're competing on quality, software quality. I think quality can actually be an aspect of security, but it's interesting to see that as one of the areas that is, a metric for them. And there was another aspect of that. There was only 18% strongly agree that moving to DevOps has a positive impact on security. And that wasn't that there were a lot of people that disagreed. I think it was more a matter of maturity that a lot of teams just weren't seeing that, security can actually become either better or it can actually become a little bit easier because we're dealing with, infrastructure as a service, which means configuration files, which means people can read them, which means maybe we can reason them a little bit easier. People are still going to make mistakes, but overall, if we do the right things and we get good visibility into all these configurations and these identity management challenges, things can be better.
Yeah, definitely agreed. It's a maturity thing. We're not there yet. We talk about it all the time. We'll get there. But you're right. The ability to have all those configurations as readable files that I can now parse and look at and understand the interrelationship of and look for stuff is only going to improve the quality and security of not only the infrastructure, but the applications running that infrastructure over time. And that's where we need to get to.
Absolutely. And well, I think I think we're also going to get to a point where we look at your 14 or 15 hours of interviews that are coming out throughout the rest of the shows underneath Security Weekly. So we'll also be looking forward to learning from all of those. And I want to thank you, Matt, for your voice making it through these two segments after a week in Vegas. I want to thank everyone for listening, and we are going to be back next week on Application Security Weekly.